A completely unexpected turn in Ukrainian politics. Recently dismissed from his position as Ukraine's Minister of Defense, Mikhail Fedorov, immediately after calling for elections in Ukraine, is heading to the United States of America to attract funding for projects in the field of new defense technologies. Well, at least that's what Mikhail Fedorov's team is calling the official reason for his trip to Washington. Supposedly, Mikhail Fedorov is planning to launch a number of projects related to the war and Ukrainian startups, and one of them will be an investment fund. Although other sources claim that Mikhail Fedorov is going to the US for political support since he has decided to set out to build a political career. But Mikhail Fedorov himself said in an interview today that he will not be meeting with American politicians or officials in the US. He is focused on continuing reforms in Ukraine related to the development of military technologies, which is why the meetings are planned specifically for this purpose. But this trip is happening exactly at the moment when Mikhail Fedorov himself made the sharpest political break with Volodymyr Zelensky in all their 7 years of working together. And it's simply impossible to rule out a political motive. Let's figure out together what's real, what's behind Fedorov's trip to the United States, and what new things he revealed to us today. My name is Alexei Pechiy, let's discuss this topic together, but before we start I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this episode and leave any comment you like. So, the British publication The Guardian writes that former Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhail Fedorov quickly received a draft deferment and is already heading to the United States of America next week. According to The Guardian, after calling for elections to be held during the war, he intends to secure political support from Washington. Let me remind you, Fedorov suggests holding elections precisely during the hostilities because it's unclear how much longer the war will last. I have a separate episode on this topic on this YouTube channel, so go check it out to be fully up to date. And just today, Mikhail Fedorov himself talked about this trip to the US in an exclusive interview with my former colleagues at Channel 24. When directly asked by the journalist whether he is planning, as some media outlets have written, to secure the support of the American president or the American political establishment, Fedorov replied, quote, "No, not at all. I don't even know where such news comes from. This is our internal matter." To start communicating and somehow promoting this abroad, personally it doesn't feel natural to me. I would like us to discuss this with the public. This is our homework, something for our country to handle internally. No one from outside should be dictating anything to us. We have to decide what to do, so that's not true. Well, supposedly there is no political purpose to this trip to the US. Although Fedorov, in an interview with Channel 24, still actively commented on how exactly the elections should be held in Ukraine. And he stated that he is allegedly already negotiating with specialists who have worked and are working on how exactly to hold elections during wartime. Because for Ukraine this is a first, nothing like this has ever happened before, and very few people understand what to do about it, and Mikhail Fedorov also reminded that President Zelensky himself, back in December of last year, instructed the parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, to develop legislation for holding elections during wartime. Indeed, let me remind you, after the first calls from Donald Trump, remember when the negotiation track seemed to become more active? At the end of 2025, Zelensky really did instruct lawmakers, saying, "Sit down, create a commission and develop legislation. What should we do? How should we hold elections? Right during the war?" And according to Mikhail Fedorov, that very legislation is already about 70% ready, but then President Zelensky's office stopped the process of developing the legislation. Fedorov described the real purpose of his trip to the US as follows, quote, "First of all, it is related to the work I am currently doing with the Eastern Europe Foundation. I have tasks related to attracting additional funds to the foundation. There are certain meetings with partners. Plus, I think there are a few important meetings related to the defense sector, to attracting investments. They will take place both in Europe and in the United States, so it's about developing new projects." When asked about a possible meeting with Elon Musk, Fedorov answered evasively, quote, "We'll see." I'm sure at this point you have a question. So what kind of projects is Mikhail Fedorov planning to launch, that he's even opening a separate venture fund and will be attracting investments for this? And here, on this question, Fedorov was as detailed as possible. The first project is a venture fund that will attract Western capital to invest in Ukrainian startups and developers, with a priority on inexpensive missiles. According to him, they are the future of warfare with artificial intelligence, and also on the robotization and sensorization of the front line to completely, or at least as much as possible, remove infantry from constant drone attacks. The second project is Think Tank, a think tank where specialists will come up with ideas. How to stop the war and defeat Russia, shaping the rules of the game for the next stages of the conflict. It's cool, it sounds great. I know that in many companies, at least in companies developing artificial intelligence, there are such think tanks where they do forecasting, write out scenarios of what could happen and what couldn't happen, different options, and so on and so on. So it's a super cool idea. Really, to work through as many scenarios for how events could unfold as possible. Choose the one that fits and, let's say, adapt all your capabilities and actions specifically to the most likely scenarios of this war and how to actually defeat Russia. Third, maybe startups in the field of artificial intelligence and defense tech. Separately, Fedorov has this great idea to develop a course on reforms in several universities. Asked where exactly he plans to raise funds, Fedorov mentions various institutional funds, big tech companies and private investors. So it's all Western money. There are various institutional funds, big tech companies, private investors, so these are all Western funds. I wouldn't want to build it in a way that it would be somehow connected to the state budget. I would like us to find funding abroad, support talent in Ukraine, and help our military. But still, why did suspicions about political motives behind Fedorov's trip to the US arise in the first place? Let me remind you, on Tuesday, August 18, Fedorov himself published a video message in which he publicly called for holding elections during the war for the first time, despite the fact that the Constitution of Ukraine directly prohibits this under martial law. It was the move that effectively ended Fedorov's relationship with his former boss, Volodymyr Zelensky. And now the Washington Post calls this move by Fedorov a surprisingly direct challenge to the authority of President Volodymyr Zelensky, which could test the strength of Ukrainian unity. In the statement itself, without mentioning Zelensky by name, Fedorov attacked the issue of corruption, the lack of transparency in decision-making, and a system in which loyalty is rewarded more than competence. Here is his quote. "The old system too often lives by its own rules. It protects itself. It is afraid of change." Later, Fedorov developed this idea even more harshly, directly pointing to the head of the Servant of the People faction, David Arachamia, hinting at someone's private interest in the defense industry, pharmaceuticals, the gambling business, and the tax sector. However, he refused to name specific corrupt officials, only promising, quote, "The time will come and all Ukrainians will know these names. Some will learn their names from law enforcement recordings, others from journalist investigations." But then, something completely unexpected happened here. For more than a month, let me remind you, demonstrators gathered at Ivan Franko Square near the theater by President Volodymyr Zelensky's office, chanting not the president's name, but the name of the person he recently fired. On Sunday, August 16, 2000, officially 2,000 people marched along Kreshchatyk with cardboard signs in support of the person who was fired. Quite a twist. The main organizers of the protest spoke out against the very idea of holding elections during the war and essentially announced the end of the protest movement. The protest organizer Kaziatyński thanked everyone who joined the demonstration, but at the same time directly wished success to the new Minister of Defense, Yevgeny Khmar, whom Zelensky appointed this week as the permanent successor to Fedorov. Kaziatyński called the real achievements of the protest movement not the return of Fedorov, but the dismissal of Commander-in-Chief Syrski and the appointment of Mikhailo Dropatov. And with that, the protest ended. Overall, if you follow my Telegram channel Pechiy News, I said about 2 weeks ago that there would be no effect, the protest would achieve nothing. And the story with Fedorov as Minister of Defense, it's been over for a long time. That's it, you can put an end to it. So literally in just a few days, Fedorov, you could say, managed to make the sharpest political break with his former patron Zelensky all at once. And lose the support of that very strict coalition that had been demanding his return to the post for a month. On the other hand, up until the very call for elections, Fedorov repeatedly demonstrated loyalty to Zelensky, and after being dismissed, he publicly refused other positions offered to him, well, for example, the post of presidential advisor on reforms. He also stated that he declined a cooperation project with Palantir Technologies, that very American technology company with which the Ukrainian military began cooperating while he was still serving as minister. In other words, Fedorov deliberately and consistently built up the image of a loyal but principled technocrat right up until the very break. It's worth remembering what Fedorov is actually known for during his time as minister, because this explains why he has such political influence and connections with American tech giants, which he now plans to use for his investment fund. The advance of the Russian army in the occupied territories has almost stopped this year. This is precisely because of the defense built by the armed forces of Ukraine with the help of drones. Medium-range drones have made it possible to undermine the logistics of Russian forces and cut off supplies to Crimea. And long-range strikes have deprived Russia of about a third of its oil refining capacity. Fedorov maintains close personal ties with American companies such as SpaceX and Palantir. His personal appeal to Elon Musk led to the company disabling Starlink terminals in January that were illegally in the possession of the Russian army. At the same time, Kiev is now asking the US to allow the use of Starlink for strikes against complexes launching ballistic missiles on Russian territory. But according to Fedorov, he was not able to convince Elon Musk himself of this, although he continues to keep in touch with him, even after being dismissed from the post of defense minister. In addition, The Atlantic magazine writes that Ukraine has prepared a plan for a large-scale attack on Moscow's airports, for which they planned to use a swarm of autonomous drones with artificial intelligence. The operation was undermined. Ukraine planned to launch up to 1,000 small and inexpensive drones in one night. Their task was to overwhelm air defenses and paralyze Moscow's airports for a long time, so that international airlines would simply refuse to fly to the Russian capital. In this way, Ukraine hoped to force Vladimir Putin to return to negotiations to end the war. But according to The Atlantic, Zelensky allegedly abandoned such a plan. Although now, the president's office says that this is complete nonsense and that no such plan ever existed. In conclusion, formally, Fedorov himself denies any political motive for his trip to the US, insisting that it's solely about attracting Western money for a venture fund, think tank and startups in the field of cheap rockets and frontline robotics. In other words, continuing exactly the work he was doing as Minister of Defense. But the trip itself coincided in time with Fedorov's most high-profile political split with Zelensky. And it was exactly this context, a call for elections during the war, an attack on corruption in President Zelensky's inner circle, plus the loss of support from his own street coalition, who rejected his idea, makes journalists, including myself, repeatedly ask him about the true motives of his trip, despite direct denials. So Fedorov says, no, come on, this is definitely not about politics, but everything looks exactly like it's about politics. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone.